It's the
Okay,
gun.
and you can see my face now? Okay,
No.
no? Uh,
Can we see your face? Yes, we can.
Yes, okay, great. So I welcome to this very special webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Sussman. I am a professor of public administration in the Andreas School of Business at Barry University in Miami, Florida, and co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Luis Fleischman and I, along with a team of dedicated colleagues, established the center as an outlet for the marketplace of ideas. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current, local, national, and international challenges. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront challenges that affect our world. Our core values of diversity, balance, and community define us and set us apart from other organizations. As an organization, we value diverse voices and views and see it as a means to create a healthy debate. The center provides a balanced platform where civilized communication, exchange of ideas, and inclusion prevail over party politics and dogmatic views. Our objective is to be a community and place of gathering for academics, professionals, elected officials, decision makers, and civil society groups and leaders. So please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org. On the site, you'll find links to our past webinars. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. Through your generous donations, we are able to bring you important and timely programs and articles. Today, and this evening in Israel, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is thrilled to present a compelling webinar titled "A Military Assessment of the Russian Invasion of Ukraine," featuring Dr. Eado Hecht, military historian and research fellow at the Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. Momentarily, Dr. Luis Fleischman will do the formal introduction. We welcome your questions. You can write your questions in the chat box. You can also email me your questions at stephen@palmbeachdemocracy.org, or when we are ready for questions, you can raise your hand virtually or otherwise. I now welcome Dr. Fleischman, co-founder of the center.
Hi, thank you so much, Steve. Yes, we indeed encourage people to ask questions and speak up directly. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce somebody whom I have known for 44 years, Dr. Eado Hecht. Now, we met for the first time as young conscripts in the Israeli army. We were very young then, of course. I mean, Eado still looks very young. And then when we had the 40-year reunion, I saw him again after many, many decades that I haven't heard a word from him about him. And a friend of mine told me, you know, Eado became a high military intelligence officer and also a scholar. So since then, we started contacting again and exchanging ideas and articles, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not. Fine. When the war in Ukraine began a month ago, I was fortunate to be in Dr. Hecht's mailing list and read his articles and memos that analyzed the current war. It was then that the idea occurred to me that Eado could be a great speaker for our center to discuss a subject that we have never discussed before in this forum, in this center, namely military strategy. Now, we are hearing a lot about how the Russians are not performing as anticipated and that the Ukrainians are courageously resisting. However, what is going to be the final outcome of this conflict, we don't know yet. What is exactly happening on the ground? Dr. Hecht will explain this to us. A little bit of just a short introduction, because I think his bio here is very humble in relation to what he really is. I think Eado is a humble person. Dr. Hecht is a defense analyst specializing in military theory and military history. He lectures at Bar-Ilan University, Haifa University, and the IDF Command and General Staff College. He also serves on the editorial advisory panel of the Journal of Military Operations. He completed his PhD from Hebrew University. And Eado, without further ado, the floor, you are very welcome here. You are welcome here, and the floor is yours, Dr. Hecht.
Thank you. Again, because of the technical issues, I've become the host. So if anybody has a question, I have to notice it. I'm sorry. Well, I'm concentrating on the lecture as well. So if I miss you, don't give up. It take me a couple more minutes. The war in Ukraine, it's problematic in many ways because we're talking about something that is ongoing. And wars are a mess. Wars are confusing. Very often the people who are actually involved in them have a difficult time understanding what's happening in real time. Sometimes you find out what you've been doing only after the war is over. And this war is no exception, plus a problem that I will mention with just this single slide. The amount of propaganda, to put it politely, less politely, outright lying by both sides is enormous. It's very, very difficult to work out what they're doing, what they know they're doing, what they don't know they're doing. Since most of our information comes secondhand, either unless we can actually read the statements of their various spokespersons, and the Russians for the first 2 weeks didn't speak at all. So all we heard was the Ukrainian side. And add to that, a lot of partisan amateur information also crept in. My colleagues and I have been scouring Twitter and TikTok and Telegram and Facebook, and I can't even give you a whole list. I don't remember it all. Looking for bits and pieces that people are pushing in there and trying to figure out which one of them is telling the truth, which one of them is actually from Ukraine and not from somewhere else who pretends to be from Ukraine. If we see pictures, are these pictures from actually Ukraine or is it from another war that somebody just changed the caption? That happens a lot too. Sometimes in our wars, you see pictures from Syria, from Iraq, from all sorts of places, and you get the caption, this is what's happening in Israel. And it's happening in the war in Ukraine as well. So we're all the time trying to figure out what's happening, and it's complicated. So what I'm going to give you is an idea, the best that we've managed to assess. We're still not 100% sure about what I'm going to say, but this is the best that we can offer at this time. I'm not sure if we'll ever get the whole picture because both sides are very, very strict on their security. Last year, if you remember the Nagorno-Karabakh war, after we had the same problem, and after the war, an Armenian general who quit about 2 weeks, 3 weeks after the war, and he stated when he quit, he went to the media and he said, "We've been lying too much. In every war, you have to protect the truth, and you have to lie a bit, but instead of lying 30%, we lied 100%. And I think we're getting, I don't know if it's 100% or 90 or 70, but we're getting a very similar problem here in order to understand what's happening. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt. And especially since you are mostly focused on Western media has taken sides. And once it's taken sides, then the quality of information you're getting is obviously in that direction. I've seen, I follow also what certain other institutes around the world write. And I won't give names, but at least one of them, I've noticed that they're simply parroting everything that the Ukrainian defense spokesman is saying. They're not even bothering to try and check it. You just quote it. I think that's a bad way to conduct research, but that's another story. So this is part of our problem, and take this into account. Now, part of the problem is that in order to understand what is happening, you have to understand also the other side of the story. And the Ukrainian story, I'm sure you're all aware of. The NATO story, I'm sure you're all aware of. What people are less aware of, at least people I've spoken to, and maybe this audience is different, but just in case I have to explain it, the Russian story is very different. And in order to understand what is happening or what decisions the Russians made, what military decisions they made, you have to understand their political views. And it includes two basic factors or claims, arguments. First, the centerpiece of the story is what they view as a NATO threat on Russia. Now, I know NATO looks at it exactly the opposite, but the Russians look at NATO as a threat. Anybody who's read Thucydides remembers that he gave 3 reasons that most people go to war, and one of them is fear of the other group that's getting too strong, and if I don't do it now, they'll kill me tomorrow. And this is the way the Russians view it. They see an aggressive alliance that won the Cold War and is determined to topple the regime in Russia, and made a promise in the early 90s that they wouldn't come closer to Russia, and are gradually breaking that promise. Now, if you look at the map, you see the red line is roughly the border of Russia. The blue line is roughly the border of NATO today. This isn't where NATO was in the early 90s. It was, of course, the border of Germany. All these countries were a Warsaw Pact. And the Russians want to maintain a buffer zone. So you see here Georgia between Russia and Turkey. You see Ukraine, which is the center of our discussion. And you see Belarus over here. They would have preferred the Baltics also not to be part of NATO. But when that happened, they were too weak to do anything about it except complain. So that's what they did. They complained and did nothing. So this is the first Russian argument of why this war is happening. The second, in order to understand that Ukraine is especially important, you have to look at these 2 arrows. If Ukraine becomes part of NATO, that means that the border of NATO comes to within a short distance with comfortable roads and railroads leading to Moscow. In other words, for military purposes, a comfortable route of maneuver. And since we talk a lot about the gas and oil that Russia produces and exports, and a large part of their economy is based on this gas and oil, another arrow here shows the distance that covers to their center of their economic well-being. In other words, they're looking at this as a direct threat on their ability to function as a state and survive. They've also been saying it. It's not been a secret. They've been saying it since the early 90s. As I said, when the Baltics joined in 2004, they felt too weak to do actually anything about it. But in 2008, when Georgia began talking about joining NATO, and NATO didn't say no, then the Russians attacked Georgia and put it in its place. I'm using this term, a colloquial term, but this is the way they felt about it. They didn't conquer all of Georgia. They don't want to have Georgia part of Russia. They conquered 2 small areas, which they had an excuse because there are 2 small nations living there, ethnic groups that do not want to be part of Georgia. But the Georgians understood the message. In 2014, this happened in Ukraine. A pro-Russian president was, in their eyes, removed from office by subversion. And this began a civil war. And they see it as NATO interference in Ukraine, and they responded, they reacted to prevent this from actually happening. And then everything sort of calmed down for a while. The fighting didn't. There's been continuous fighting along the front line, but very low scale fighting. We have a bitter joke in Israel that on lunch break you go to eat lunch, on smoking break you go to smoke, and at fire break, which is the literal Hebrew expression for ceasefire, obviously you continue firing, just less. And this is what's been happening there. So in their eyes, when again Ukraine began to talk of joining NATO, and NATO didn't say no, this is a direct threat aimed at Russia. Now there's another story. The other story is, what is Ukraine? Ukraine was a part of Russia, and therefore the borders of Ukraine are not national borders. They are administrative borders from when Russia was part of Ukraine, and the whole of Eastern Ukraine, or most of Eastern Ukraine, was originally Russian, ethnically speaking. You can see on the left roughly the division of areas where Russian speakers or ethnic Russians live as a majority, and you can see Yanukovych is this pro-Russian president, where he won his majority of votes. This is Eastern Ukraine. And if you look at older history, you can understand, again, this was the area that was added only in the 1920s to the Ukraine for administrative purposes. So the Russians view this as something that was completely part of Russia, but has left Russia because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but is populated by Russians. Now, I have a student in one of my classes whose family came from Lugansk. The Ukrainians call it Luhansk with an H, and the Russians call it Lugansk with a G. This is this area here that I'm showing now. And he says, when everybody was talking about this Russian aggression and everything, he said, you don't understand. Putin isn't the conqueror, he's a savior. When we were attacked by the Ukrainians in 2014, and this is how they view it, he saved us from Ukrainian conquest, from Ukrainian oppression. So you have here a slightly different story, and in order to understand the Russian military moves, you have to understand this background. So what did the Russians hope to achieve? Well, what they hope to achieve, first of all, and the prime goal, is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. To do this, they thought they had to replace the current regime. Among other reasons, because in the Ukrainian parliament some years ago, before the current president, they passed a law which requires the government to join NATO, to work towards joining NATO. This was done at the time of the former president, and Zelensky inherited it and started doing something about it. So we have to replace him. But this is a lower level of importance than the essence of joining NATO. If Zelensky agrees not to join NATO, then Zelensky is okay, even if I don't like it. Secondly, a land bridge from Crimea to Russia. They took Crimea, again, 90% Russian population in 2014. And this area in between remained with Ukraine. Over here you have Donetsk, the Russian separatist area. You have Donetsk and you have Lugansk. You have Donetsk here. The second goal is to connect Crimea with Russia through this land area. Currently, they have to cross a bridge, which is over where I'm showing now. It's a very long bridge. It's a very big bridge. It's a highway on that bridge, and it also has a track for trains, but it's still a bridge with all the negative aspects of having to cross a very, very long bridge and having to maintain it and so on. So they want land contact. And as they see it, the population here is anyway Russian. They have another problem. In 2014, when Crimea was taken by the Russians, the Ukrainians built a dam. This line is just a rough schematic, but there is a water canal leading from the Dnieper River to Crimea. It supplies about 80% of all Crimea's fresh water. the Ukrainians, as part of their response to the Russian taking of Crimea, built a dam, stopped the water. The result is that Crimea is drying out. People do not have running water 24 hours a day, every day of the week. The farmlands are being ruined. In industry, which needs water, has problems, and so on. This is, again, one of the goals of the war or operation, however you want to call it. And lastly, if I'm going to war, then I'm going to return all the Lugansk and Donetsk, the original borders of Lugansk and Donetsk. In 2014, the Russians only stopped the Ukrainians from taking the last third. So about 2/3 of the ground that belongs to this area is until the war is part of Ukraine. And another factor, again, it's impossible to tell if the numbers are true, but this student of mine, he told me, when I told the class, look, in 2014, hundreds of thousands of people living here, Russians, became refugees in Russia because of the Ukrainian attack. He said, no, it's 3 million. It's not hundreds of thousands, it's 3 million Russians who want to go home. And if you followed the news, then one of the things that Putin said was that these Russians will go back to their villages and homes and so on. The student said, I come from a city, I don't remember which one he mentioned, which we had 1 million inhabitants, and by the end of the war, we were half of the population had left. So again, it's a completely different mindset than the one that we're used to hearing in the Western media and from Ukraine, which describes the opposite story, of course. Again, I'm assuming you all know the Ukrainian side, that's why I'm focusing on the Russian. Obviously, everything I'm saying about Russia, it's 180 degrees the opposite, what the Ukrainians claim. Okay, so let's go down to the war itself. That's just the background for understanding. When you look at this, again, you have this story that the Ukrainians are a very small army compared to the Russians. In theory, yes. In fact, not really. The Ukrainian army is the biggest in Europe, except for the Russians. The exact numbers are very difficult to work out. They're keeping it very secret. And what I've written down here, it's round numbers. It could be a bit more, it could be 1 or 2 less, but roughly this is the size of their army. And what you notice is that the Russians did not bring an army bigger than the Ukrainian army to fight them. And this goes to another factor that is part of the Russian political calculus. They thought they wouldn't have to fight. Exactly why, we can only surmise. But our theory is based on 2 things. First, the fact that the Zelensky regime was becoming very, very unpopular in Ukraine. Zelensky was voted with more than 70% of the votes. And the latest polls last summer and autumn showed him getting less than 30% of the votes. So the regime is very unpopular. And if you can remove the regime very quickly and put somebody else, maybe it'll be over with that. Secondly, most of this area is, again, most of the people living there are Russian, so we won't have to fight them. And thirdly, the Ukrainian army didn't prove itself too wonderful during the 2014 war and in the period in between. So they're not that great an army, and we can manage with less forces. Now, this is something that you have to understand in order to understand what happened in the field in the first couple of weeks of the war. Russia, the country that everybody knows when it goes to war always brings more than the enemy, went to war with less. It brought about 120 battalions along the border with Ukraine, but it only used, in the first few days, it only used about 60 of them. There are other problems. I said that in theory it can have a larger army, but the Russian army is composed of 3 types of manpower. You have conscripts who come and serve only for a year, so the level of training is basic. You have people who sign on to do, instead of 1 year, do 2 years. These people are usually conscripts that they're offered the opportunity to sign an extra year, and then they get a real salary, not just pocket money. And lastly, you have hundreds of thousands of reservists. The official number is about 900,000, but how many of them are actually available is not quite clear. Russian law does not allow the use of conscripts or reservists beyond the borders of Russia. In order for the Russian army to use conscripts, it must receive permission from the Russian parliament. Now, this is something that even in a dictatorship like Russia is something you don't do just offhand and say, I'll ignore the public opinion. Putin does not ignore public opinion. He's not a Democrat, but he doesn't ignore it. As someone once said, it's very easy to capture the throne with bayonets, but it's very difficult and very painful to sit on the bayonets once you're on the throne. So the dictators often prefer to have public opinion in their favor. They try not to aggravate too much. So about 1/3 of the Russian combat power is conscripts they can't use. They also have, as I said, official number about 900,000 reservists, but nobody's actually seen them training. Nobody's actually seen them do anything. So most are not really usable. You can't hold a reservist who served in the army 5 years ago and hasn't done anything since, no refresher training, no nothing, and say, okay, remember, that's a tank, get on and start going, start fighting. It doesn't work. You need time to refresh training and so on. But here too, you have the political problem of I need to go to the parliament, say this is a war, I need an official declaration of war. Russia has not conducted the required legal declaration of war within Russia. It's a special operation, it's not called a war. So they're not really usable. So in fact, the Ukrainians have a better, a bigger army than the Russians. And this affects what's happening. They do have a number of points in which the Russians have advantages. They have slightly more tanks. They have much more combat aircraft you see below. They have a variety of other things, but there are compensation for the Ukrainian side. You see the SAM is a surface-to-air missile. It's launchers to shoot down aircraft. So it's very difficult for the Russians to fly there, and the Ukrainians claim to have shot down more than 100 Russian aircraft already. So it's not exactly a done thing. It requires very careful planning on the Russian part if they want to win, given this ratio of forces. Now, what do we think they tried to do? Again, we don't have the plans. What we have is what we've seen them doing and try to understand, reverse engineer what was the plan. What we saw them do on the first morning is land heliborne for helicopters carrying paratroopers and special forces next to Kiev, trying to grab an airfield, which if they had succeeded, they probably would have brought in more forces with ordinary aircraft, and send the special forces into Kiev in civilian clothes to try and capture or kill the Ukrainian government, especially Zelensky and a few of his advisors and important ministers. In other words, they were trying to decapitate Ukraine politically. The goal was never to capture Kiev. Kiev is a huge city. It's 3 million people. Even if the people aren't there, think of how many buildings you need to house 3 million people. Capturing a city that size, if I'd taken the entire Russian army and sent them only there, it would have been difficult. And here they're sending a much smaller force. What happened was that apparently the Ukrainians were waiting for them, either because Ukrainian intelligence knew about this operation or because NATO intelligence, which basically means American intelligence, told them about it. I don't know, but somebody did because they were waiting. And this snatch force failed. Second thing they did on the first morning was attack the Ukrainian Air Force in an attempt to destroy it. And here's something very strange happened, which we don't have an explanation. They started the operation, they caused a lot of damage, and suddenly they stopped. And they didn't continue the next day or the day after, or for a few days. The Russian Air Force simply disappeared from the skies, as if it wasn't playing. It had decided not to play in the game. So despite destroying a very large portion of the Ukrainian Air Force, they left the sky open for the remainder of the Ukrainian Air Force to operate freely. Again, we have absolutely no explanation for this. And then you have the ground offensive, which begins immediately. If you look back at America's wars over the past 30 years, more or less, you have this sequence. You have an air attack, which continues for a certain number of days or weeks, preparing the enemy, weakening the enemy with air power, and only then you do a ground offensive. In 2003, when the American offensive into Iraq began, this is what the American military wanted to do, and there was a big argument between them and Rumsfeld, who said, no, you do them both at once. You're not going to waste a week or two just operating with the Air Force. Let the ground forces go in. We're talking about a very weak enemy. You don't have to wait. And because he's the Secretary of Defense, they have to obey his orders. So this is what happened there. But everywhere, this is the American doctrine. The Russians didn't. They haven't done this sort of thing before. They do things together, just like Rumsfeld demanded. And what do we see on the ground? We saw a ground offensive on 5 separate fronts. Now, if you remember the map I showed you, Ukraine is enormous. Again, if you compare it to the United States, it's small, but I come from a very small country. Ukraine is about 603,000 square kilometers. Israel, pre-67, is just under 21,000. Even if you add Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, and the Golan, we get to about 27,000 kilometers squared. We're talking here 603,000 square kilometers. In other words, each one of these 5 fronts is a completely separate issue, a separate war almost. What we saw with Kiev, beyond the first, what I call the Kiev snatch, they tried to encircle Kiev, not to capture it, but to reach it from 3 different directions and encircle it to apply political pressure. They tried to do the same with the city of Kharkov, a city of about 1.5 million population, which is situated in northeast Ukraine. And the majority of their forces were involved in these 2 operations, especially towards Kiev. Then you have the Lugansk and Donetsk story. I told you about the capturing the territory to the other 2/3 of Lugansk and Donetsk that remained in Ukrainian hands in 2014. And then you have an operation coming out of Crimea, which went in 2 different directions. One went north. First mission, just like the paratroopers that landed next to Kiev, the first mission that came out of Crimea was a helicopter assault with the paratroopers that landed on the dam I mentioned before and blew it up so the water would flow again to Crimea. And afterwards, they sat there and held on until a column of ground forces with armor and artillery and everything else came to support them. And that was the first operation in that direction. Then you have from Crimea going west. I'll return to the map soon, so you will be able to see it. You have going Crimea west along the Black Sea coast. You probably all heard of the attempt to reach Odessa, which has not succeeded. Not surprising, given that the fact that the amount of forces they actually sent were very small. But most of what we are hearing, and you probably read a lot about the Russian failures and tactical mistakes and so on and so forth, virtually all we're hearing is coming from the Kiev and Kharkov directions. Almost nothing is coming from the other 3. Crimea, the 2 Crimean attacks were the best handled of all the operations. We have an interview of the New York Times with a Ukrainian brigade commander who fought against this Crimean or this Russian forces coming from Crimea. And he said that within 1 or 2 days, half his brigade had been destroyed and they had to retreat 100 kilometers in order to save what was left. So this was a proper military operation, properly handled, not like we were seeing in the video clips and in the news, which is happening elsewhere. And this is the map. Now, this map is updated to approximately today. I don't know how many of you have seen maps in the press and so on. Most of the maps you see shaded areas that cover a lot of ground. I don't think that's true. It's beginning to be true today. this past couple of days. Until this last couple of days, it was separate arrows, each one going in a different direction. You can see all these arrows that I managed to collect, and I'm not sure I got all of them. Each one of them is a separate force fighting completely separately from all the rest. The word fight is also a problem. I'll go back to it in a minute. And you can see here what I mentioned, the first strike towards the dam, and then going towards Odessa. Then it went north. And what they've been trying to do over the past 2.5 weeks is connect or capture all this territory to connect it to Russia through Donetsk. This is the city of Mariupol. It is the only city in which they're conducting an actual house-to-house battle to capture every bit of the city. All the other cities they've had to pass through or by, they haven't fought for them. They surround them. You can see here a number of these cities, Sumy and Chernihiv, and forgot the name of the other one. They're just surrounding them and sitting outside the city. They're not trying to go inside. They tried to do this surround process around Kiev. You can see the various arrows coming. The Ukrainians, for obvious reasons, sent most of their forces to protect their capital. They succeeded in stopping this process of being surrounded. They succeeded also in Kharkov to stop this process. And what we've seen is something very interesting. And this again goes to the mindset of the Russians. After the first couple of days when they tried to surround Kharkov and it didn't work, they stopped trying. And instead they sent most of the forces here elsewhere, which I think shows that they're not really interested in taking Kharkov. It's a pressure point. It's an important city. We'll press on it so that you'll waste forces defending it. You'll occupy your mind with Kharkov, the same with Kiev. Once they fail to take the government, to decapitate the government, they stop trying to actually take Kiev or even surround it. After about a week of trying, we haven't seen any major attacks in this area. It's all small, little things, just to keep the Ukrainians busy and looking in that direction. And I refer to it when I talk to my colleagues. This is the matador's cloak. All this. The real center of the operation is this area here. And actually, yesterday, a Russian spokesman, for the first time, said so. Now, they mentioned that this is a goal of the war. They just didn't mention in the past that it is the goal of the war. Yesterday evening, a Russian spokesman said, we have finished the first phase of the operation, and the next phase is dedicated to completing A, this land connection, and B, the liberation of Donetsk and Lugansk. Again, I'm giving the Russian version. And you can see where they have for the past, out of this month of war, where for the past 3 weeks they've actually been trying to do something and where they're more or less playing a game. The same with Odessa. Odessa is over here. They've been sending ships with troops near Odessa, back and forth, sort of playing a sort of, here we come, actually no, we're going back to Sevastopol. Here we come again, actually no, we're going back to Sevastopol. And a small force that tried to drive along the coast. And again, the map gives a wrong idea. We're talking about enormous distances and a very small force relative to this distance. So it looks like they were saying, well, if it goes easily, wonderful, we'll take the whole coast. Ukraine is disconnected from the Black Sea. There's a lot of gas and oil that hasn't been exploited yet in this area. Wonderful. If it doesn't go, okay. And so they stopped attacking. Once they realized they're not going to get there, they stopped attacking and they're just defending here. And the Ukrainians are counterattacking. And all their offensive actions are in this area and in this area. And the same again is true of Kharkov. They've stopped attacking, only defending. And Kiev, they've stopped attacking, only defending. Any attacks that are being conducted are small scale, here a village, there a village, just to keep the Ukrainian, my opinion. Again, I'm not privy to their general staff briefings. My opinion, just to keep the Ukrainians focused on protecting this area so they won't transfer troops to other areas. The second thing they did over the past 3 weeks is that these arrows that have been so narrow, so easy to attack along the way, because most of the fighting force is in the head of the arrow, and over here it's just a long line of trucks bringing fuel and ammunition, then driving back and bringing more. A lot of Ukrainian attacks have been on these supply convoys, and now once they stopped advancing towards Kiev, they've sent combat troops back to clear the area of Ukrainian troops that have been left behind in order to protect the supplies. So what we're seeing is, again, is a refocusing on my group. We've been saying this for the past couple of weeks. Again, the Russians finally said it officially yesterday evening. And over here, what they've been doing, they've been gradually grinding their way through. There's been some talk of an attempt to surround all the Ukrainian forces here. Personally, I thought that was a bit far-fetched for two reasons. One, the ratio of forces, how many forces the Russians are using, how many the Ukrainians, and secondly, the size of the area. You can't surround somebody in an area this big if you only have 10 battalions. It's too many holes. It's like trying to hold water with a fishnet. It won't work. It does scare people. I mean, the enemy's behind me, it forces me to go back. But it doesn't, it's very difficult to actually surround them. And so this is where we've seen most of the fighting. Now, a second action that has been happening, and in the first, and again, this is something that we have to, that you hear a lot of talk about this Russian genocide or this indiscriminate bombardments and bombing. I'm not saying there aren't being civilians being killed, there are, but nothing that justifies these expressions. First of all, the Russian troops were apparently given orders not to hurt the population. They are our brothers. These are Russians. Even Ukrainians, they're cousins. They're not quite brothers, they're cousins. This is the expressions that came out in the speeches. We are not here to destroy them. We are here to replace this bad leadership they have. And then they went with a silly propaganda of calling them Nazis. And both sides are claiming the other side is a Nazi. Here in the Middle East, we have stories like that with us. During the Iran-Iraq war, when you listen to Iraqi radio, then they were fighting the Zionists in Iran. And when you listen to Iranian radio, they were fighting the Zionists in Iraq. And our prime minister then said, we wish them both luck. But here, again, both sides are using these Nazi designations, which are simply not true. Now, how do I know that they're not really killing civilians, or at least not trying not to? Because I mentioned before these TikToks and things that we're following. At first, the Russians weren't saying what they were doing, and the Ukrainians the official Ukrainians were saying, we're stopping them, we're holding them, we're defeating them. And then you see this Ukrainian civilian who doesn't know that he's supposed to back up the government story, and he's filming a column of Russian tanks passing by his house. And the Ukrainian government is saying, we're stopping them on the border, and this fellow is over here, or somewhere like that. In other words, he's 30, 50 kilometers behind the border. So this is how we followed the advance of the Russian troops. We saw Ukrainians taking their phone cameras and publishing, here, some Russians passed my house. Now, in addition, when I'll go back to the story of who they're killing and who not, you have films in which you see the Ukrainian, again, these are Ukrainian films, not Russian films. You have Ukrainian films in which they're saying, look how heroic we are. We're stopping the Russians by standing in the road without weapons in front of the Russian tanks. Okay, you're very brave, that's true, because you don't know that they're not going to shoot. But what I'm looking at it and seeing is a Russian tank column stopping and waiting for them to disperse without doing anything. Now, they could have shot them, they could have driven through them. This is the kind of thing we've come to expect from Russians. This is what we were told. This is how Russians behave, but they're not doing it. They're just standing with the tanks and waiting for the crowd to disperse. After a while, they began to use more artillery in built-up areas, more artillery in places where you have civilians. By then, a large part of the civilian population had moved. If you're talking about 10 million refugees in Ukraine, most of them are from these combat areas. So that a lot of these villages and towns and cities are partially empty. And we've seen other things. So we're told, for instance, if you remember last week about this shopping mall that was bombed by the Russians, but you have photographs that from underneath the roof, you can see Ukrainian artillery battery there. In other words, it's a military target. The fact that they didn't close the mall so that civilians wouldn't be in the top floor doesn't change the fact that they've put a battery of Grad rocket launchers underneath the building. And when the bomb hits, there's a huge explosion that wrecks both buildings that isn't just a bomb. It's more. It hit something that blew up the buildings. So there was ammunition underneath. And then you see a photograph when they're clearing the wreckage. I saw a photograph in which you could see rockets. Again, this is not from Russian sources. I've seen photographs, again, Ukrainian soldiers photographing themselves, placing in schools. Now, obviously, once they shoot from the school, the Russians are going to shoot back. And then, of course, the Russians are shooting up schools and hospitals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not saying the Russians are good people and saints and so on, but all I'm saying is that the story is much more complicated, and at least on the political level, they regarded this as an operation in friendly territory. Now, why is this important? Because it explains a lot of their failures in the first couple of weeks. They did not expect to fight. One of the things that analysts of the Russian army were looking at and saying, but this isn't the Russian army. We've seen how they what kind of things they do in their exercises. We've seen what they've done in former wars. They're not doing it. They're just driving like an administrative drive, like a march. So you see a column of vehicles just driving along a road, no security, no scouts, no protection, no somebody looking out, where's the enemy and so on, just driving. And then, of course, they get shot up in an ambush. And in the first week, this mindset that we're not going to war, we're going we're just going to drive through Ukraine, it messed up their whole operation, because what they suffered in this first week is enormous casualties. Nobody knows the exact extent. Again, here you have a lot of propaganda too, but enormous casualties. And this messed up their whole ability to continue the battle. What they did in the second week, after they realized what was happening, was to try to reorganize. And I'm sure you all remember these photographs of these huge traffic jams of Russian trucks and equipment jammed on all these roads. What these traffic jams was an attempt to reorganize the entire force, move it around, shift it around, bring up ammunition and everything you need to actually fight. You're not just driving, you have to actually fight. So you need ammunition, you need all sorts of equipment, you need more troops up front. And it took them about a week to reorganize this whole thing. And again, given the sizes we're talking about of the ground and the forces, it's a pretty difficult job to do. It's not surprising. There aren't that many roads. And if you get off the road, you sink, because at this time of year in Ukraine, if it's not below zero, then the ground is completely soggy, and you take a tank off the road and that's it. It doesn't move anymore. It just sinks into the mud. And so what they've been trying to do over the past couple of weeks is recover from this terrible loss. And again, their problem is the manpower. They can't bring the conscripts, they can't bring the reserves to fill up the casualties of those 2-year personnel that signed on for this. So they're trying to bring helpers from abroad. There's a very large Chechen contingent that's helping them. They're bringing people from Ossetia. Ossetia is one of the areas in Georgia that I mentioned before, that they wanted Russian occupation because they preferred it over Georgian occupation. The same with Abkhazia. They're bringing people from Syria. They're bringing people from Libya. They're offering them money, good money to do and come reinforce the Russian army in its fight. And many of these people are coming not just for the money. They're saying, we owe the Russians, because these are places that they received help from the Russians in their wars. So Syrian fighters who the Russians helped against the other side in the Syrian civil war are volunteering to help the Russians in their war. Libyan fighters also, and so on and so forth. So this is what we're seeing now. And on the strategic level, I mentioned, I think, enough. So I just want one last thing, and then we'll open for questions. What we've been seeing the last couple of days is, for the first time, a lot of Ukrainian counterattacks. As the Russians have stopped attacking, the Ukrainians have recovered their breath and are beginning to counterattack. So the first place that we saw a real counterattack was in this area down in the south. Then we saw a few in the area of Kiev. And again, these arrows, you have to be very careful with them. Don't take these arrows as being exactly where it's happening. It's a rough area because it's very difficult to tell the exact story. And the Ukrainians are trying to take back ground that they lost over the past month. So all this I've spoken about. That's it. I think it's time for the Congress, any questions if you have.
This is excellent, Dr. Hecht. Excellent, very impressive. I appreciate it. Luis would like to ask the first question.
Yes, I take the privilege of to ask the first question, but I encourage everyone to ask questions. And I have, in one question, I have two questions. The first is...
of course, Luis.
Yes. So, Dr. Hecht, two things. The first is, you said that the Russians are basically careful with what they do. Is definitely not a genocide, which I could agree with that. But on the other hand, you say that they are taking into account, they are being more humane than what we know based on the history of the Russians. But on the other hand, we are witnessing cities such as Mariupol being wiped out, and millions of refugees. And I think it is hard to say that the Russians are being humane seeing these pictures. I would like you to answer to this. And
first of all, just let me start with this one. War is never humane. War is a very inhumane action where you use violence. When I say relatively speaking, I can show you pictures of Grozny and Chechnya before and after. Mariupol is the one place there's a lot of house-to-house fighting, and there's a lot of disagreement there also exactly who's doing most of the damage, the defenders or the attackers. Now, I'm not saying it's this or that. I'm saying there's a problem to find out exactly what is happening. Because for every film you hear about how the Russians are not allowing the civilians to leave, I have a film that I received showing Russian soldiers helping people out of their basements, giving them food, giving them medical assistance, putting them on buses, and taking them out of the city somewhere else. So again, I don't know who's telling the truth. Definitely there's a battle there, and unlike the other cities in which the Russians did not enter, Mariupol they intend to take. So you have to fight house to house, and they're losing lots of people too.
Now,
please.
My second question is, the Russians actually announced more or less what you just said, that they are concentrating in the areas of Donbass, and that will be it. It seems to me that that's what the Russians are saying. The Ukrainians are saying, we don't believe the Russians. The Russians actually lied. They say they were not going to attack Ukraine, and they did attack Ukraine. The Russians violated several accords that they had with NATO. So what do you think? You seem to believe that the Russians are going to concentrate on the Donbass area and leave the other cities alone. They just, bombarding a little bit in order to distract them.
I think that I'm not saying this can't change in the future, but currently I don't see that the Russians have the combat power to do more than that. Again, once they're limited by the size of their army, one of the discussions we had in the group I work with, one of the fellows said, yes, when they attack, they'll try to surround the Ukrainians by going in, never mind, a certain direction and capturing a certain area, and then they'll surround. I said, look at how many forces you have over such an area. It's not really surrounding them. It's just like putting dots, and they can just go through them. They have a limitation of fighting power. At first, they thought that was okay because they thought there wasn't going to be a war. Once the war began, they began to realize that they have a limitation. So I think this is something that it doesn't matter what the Russians want, this is what they can do. Now, if something changes over the coming days, some real intervention of some power that enables things to change, then yes, maybe they'll change their views too. They paid a high price, something they might have been willing to accept 8 months ago, they won't be willing to accept today. Something they might have been willing to accept last month, they won't not necessarily will be willing to accept today because they want to see, we've paid a price. I want to get something I can show for it. So goals change during a war. We've seen that in almost every war. You start with a certain objective, and gradually, as things happen, you change for more or for less as things develop. I think the Russians had a certain agenda. They partially failed to achieve it. They're now trying to get the best they can. Can they do more? I don't see that they can, unless, again, something really changes in the field.
Okay, thank you, Eado.
And of course, remember that the ancient Jewish sages said that after the destruction of the temple, prophecy is the province of fools. So I'm being careful here.
Yeah.
Dr. Hecht, has anyone written in the text box? Because I can't see it from.
No, I don't see anything.
Encourage people to speak up.
No,
Okay.
but you can just open your microphones.
I have a question. I don't think you addressed this. Sort of it might not be a heavyweight question, but people are talking about this nuclear option. Putin mentions, nuclear. What is your opinion about where that might be headed?
I think that is that's his deterrence from NATO actual intervention more than you're doing now. Because NATO right now is part of the war; it's supplying weapons, and the threat, as some people are trying. I heard the Poles trying to convince NATO to send troops in to Ukraine and so on. Mm-hmm. He's saying that to make sure you don't. I think that's the main thing. I don't think he really wants to go nuclear. I mean, nuclear war, once you start, I don't see how you can stop. Certainly not with an existing Russia. I don't think it bodes well for Russia, a nuclear war. I think this war in general is going to cause Russia a lot of damage in the long run. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking just about the economic issues, because that, if the war ends quickly, then that might change. A lot of people need Russian economy. And right now they're sort of gritting their teeth because of the war, but once the war is over, they'll wait till things calm down and they'll reconnect. Mm-hmm. But Russia has lost a lot of political clout, a lot of military threatening clout, and what he has left is the nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see that you're such a hit here. They want to be on your mailing list. Do you have a mailing list of sorts?
I'm afraid in Hebrew only. Louis has the advantage that he speaks the language, so I send him a copy. But I've been writing mostly for people I work with and students and so on. So I was actually quite surprised that in Hebrew it got a bit like the coronavirus. I lost control where it went. I'm getting answers from people. If people ask me questions, I don't even know who they are. But I'm afraid I just don't have the time to do it in English as well. Sorry.
Well, there's such a thing, Beth Ann, I know you asked, there is such a thing as Google Translate. Remember that.
Yeah, so Luis can send it on to whoever wants. Yeah. He has it in Word form. Yeah. It's not PDF, it's Word. So you can just copy it, do with it whatever you want. I have no problem.
Another possibility, and that I was thinking, Dr. Hecht, Eado, is maybe you want to write a piece in English for us, and then we can publish it, or you can write it in Hebrew, and I'll be happy to translate.
Okay, we'll have to talk about that, what exactly you want, but yeah. And by the way, the presentation, I can send it to you, and you can have it, including the bits I didn't show, because I have it, what I've said, with the map, I have it also written down there on slides, so you can hand it out to whoever wants it.
One of the people online today is Joel Levin, who writes for us quite a bit and is very involved. So I don't know whether you have any questions. And I don't mean to put you on the spot. Yes, I do, actually.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I just sent, I joined late. I apologize. It was a terrific presentation. I just sent something on the chat. So my question is, there have been, I think, 6 generals of various ranks and 1 admiral who were killed. Is that a significant problem? Is that just a sort of psychological blow? I mean, do they have endless generals?
First of all, it's a big army, so they have lots of generals to lose.
Okay.
And an English officer once told me that in his regiment, they have this toast that before supper, when they pick up the glass, they say, difficult wars, quick promotions. Because the upper rank is lost and then you can get promoted. I don't think it's a problem. I come from an army in which we pride ourselves in the fact that the officers suffer most of the casualties. We've lost some pretty high-ranking officers over the years. It's part of I think it shows that these generals are going on the ground and looking with their own eyes to see what's happening, rather than sitting back in some safe bunker and looking at a map and just saying things. They're going forward to the troops and saying, follow me. Here, you do this. I'm with you. I'm taking the risks with you. So again, it's a question it's a cultural issue. Some armies think this is a waste of a general's life. I spent so many years preparing him for the job, and now I'm losing him as an ordinary rifleman. But it's good for morale. You can see the general walking next to you, and there's a price to be paid for morale. It's also good for his understanding what the problem is. There's lots of criticism during First World War about the generals who sat in the chateau behind and sent the troops forward in the trenches. And there's a story, nobody knows if it's true or not, about this British officer who came once to the field and said, what, we sent them to attack like that? Good God, if I'd have known, I wouldn't have done it. So why didn't you come before to look? So I think it's not really a problem. I mean, it's not a physically a problem. They have enough generals. And I think it's more, it improves their ability to fight.
Let me ask a different kind of question. The different kind of question is, I just had a long talk with a friend of mine who ran one of the international law firms in Moscow for about 25 years. And he was giving me his analysis, which he says that over the last 20 years, Putin has put in power at not only the upper levels, but the medium levels of every single aspect of Russian government, KGB people. And KGB people are very different than military people. They're also very different than the world he is, legal and financial people. And he has commented to me over the years about their incompetence. But he also thinks the KGB is incompetent on military matters. They're not military. They're spies, and they're doers of single operations. Do you have a comment on the ability of the army to operate as a sort of classic in the United States, a classic, let's say, Eisenhower, Marshall Bradley army of World War II, without worrying much about spies and not worrying much about Congress and not worrying much about anything, just sort of West Point people doing their jobs?
First of all, the Russian military is segregated. They're trained to be officers, not politicians. That doesn't mean there aren't politicians among them, but that's not what they're trained to do. In that sense, they're completely accept the rule of the civilians, of the bureaucrats. So I don't think that's the problem. It's not the days of Stalin when you said the wrong thing and you ended up with a bullet in the head. That doesn't mean you can't get fired if you fail too often, but it's much more whether you succeed or fail. And in every human organization, you have connections and so on. The fact that he put a lot of KGB people is part of the idea of him keeping himself in power. That's how he controls the system. As to their ability to do their jobs, I really can't say. It's not my expertise. I'm more in the military. But people who are trained in a particular way of thinking, they usually, when they go to do another job, they carry over their capabilities and their lack of capabilities. Very few people actually manage to do the transition properly. Here in Israel, for instance, we have an issue because a lot of people stay in the army, become generals. When they come out, they want to do something. A lot of them go into politics. And very few of them are actually very successful at it. It's not that our generals are political in the party sense when they're in the army, but when they come out, they really don't know how to do party politics, how to do national politics. So you have a few very successful people like Moshe Dayan, but most of them failed. I think this would probably, I think it's a human thing, not an Israeli thing. And I don't know how many generals in your country managed to do the transition of those who tried. So I think this is a real problem for them.
Well, I think he was more concerned about the control at the top, that the military didn't speak directly to Putin, but always was filtered through the KGB.
That would be a problem because it means that he gets a not good enough view of what's happening. That could also be part of the issue that I mentioned at first, that they thought there wouldn't be a war, that they thought it would be basically a sort of a basic entry battle, what we call in the army a breakthrough battle, and then drive. And if you get the wrong picture, how difficult it is. I read comments people are making, wow, they look how they messed up. Say, look, you're talking about somebody who's just driven 100 kilometers into enemy territory. What exactly do you think is going to happen there? The Russians are failing. They're walking too slowly. I don't see many armies doing 100 kilometers in 2 days against resistance. People who don't understand these little things of what gets in the way. And if you have an echelon that's separating the military from Putin, who doesn't understand these little things, that could make a big difference. That could explain a lot of the failures.
I'd like to interrupt here. I know we've gone over our hour, and Dr. Hecht, you've given us plenty of time. I do appreciate. I want to be sensitive to your time, and I know it's the dinner hour in Israel now. So, does anyone else have any last questions?
I have one quick question.
Okay.
Hi, Steve.
Hello. I
Hello.
spent 8 months studying Russian in Tbilisi last year, and so I'm very interested in the former Soviet space. One of the reasons behind this war is NATO, and part of Russia's playbook has been to make sure that certain countries can't meet the criteria of not having territorial disputes. And we see that in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We see that in Ukraine with Crimea and eastern provinces with separatist movements. And we also see that in Moldova with Transnistria.
Yeah.
We've spoken a lot about Ukraine and what's happening. What do we see? Do we see any possibility of Russia going into Georgia or going into Transnistria or Moldova as part of this plan to bring back this USSR?
I'm not sure they want to bring back this USSR. I think they really want a buffer zone. I think the maximum they want from Ukraine is the east, and the rest pacified, so that it's between them and NATO. I don't think they want to dominate in the sense that you don't do things I don't like, but they don't want to run it on a day-to-day basis. Let the Ukrainians run themselves, so long as they don't let NATO in. And part of the problem, I think, is that for them, the EU is just a transition phase into NATO in their eyes. In other words, if Ukraine starts getting too close to the EU, they're looking at it as, they're just opening the door to get a leg in. And that's part of the problem. I think the same thing in Georgia. This is what happened in 2008. And again, they didn't take all of Georgia. They stopped. They could have. They stopped. Because they're interested in having this buffer. They can't do it in the Baltics. That's a problem. That's a lost cause. Could some situation occur in the future in which we might see this sort of thing in the Baltics? I find it hard to believe they take the risk because that's already a NATO country. But theoretically, at least it could. Ukraine, though, is much, much more important than the Baltics in terms of where it is and what it threatens and so on. So I don't see them, again, being very careful here, but I don't see them trying to say taking the rest of Georgia and so on. Chechnya was a different story because Chechnya was not supposed to be an independent state and it rebelled. So once they recovered, they retook it.
Once they recovered, what you say, Eado?
I said once they recovered it, they were the first time when the Chechens rebelled, they tried to retake Chechnya and they failed miserably. Yeah. It was a debacle of epic proportions.
Yeah.
And so when they came back in 2000 and took Chechnya, it had two goals. One was because Chechnya was supposed to be still part of Russia, unlike Georgia, for instance, or Ukraine. And secondly, because they had to show that we recovered. We're no longer that thing, that terrible army that was so humiliated in 1995, 1996.
It was the second Chechen war, which was brutal too. Was brutal, yeah.
Like I said, I can show pictures of Grozny before, Grozny after, and then compare it to the Ukrainian cities, and you see the difference.
And if I may, one more quick question.
Sure.
In recent UN General Assembly votes, we've seen certain countries abstain. And many of those countries, when it comes to calling out Russia on its aggression in Ukraine, many of those countries are in Central Asia and the Caucasus, like Armenia, that are former members of the USSR, but also current members of the CIS. We recently saw the CIS come back to life in Kazakhstan in the repression of protest movements by Russian forces. But here in Ukraine, we haven't really seen support from the CIS. We've seen, and any support that has been for Ukraine was before the invasion, and what we're seeing is abstention. Do we foresee, Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, where Russia has a military base, getting involved to some capacity, or are they just sitting this out completely? We see this. There's a very famous saying in Russian of, well, when Russia sneezes, Central Asia gets a cold. So what's going on here with the stands?
That's something I'm sorry. This is something I really can't comment on. I haven't the knowledge enough. I can tell you there are Russian forces in those areas. And for instance, there's a Russian brigade in Armenia that they sent some of it over to Ukraine. Now, immediately, we've been seeing more incidents on the Armenian-Azerbaijan border. The Azeris are becoming more active, more aggressive towards Armenia. So, you can't really, you have to be careful. You can't really remove people too much. But I don't know enough about these countries and how exactly their relations are with Russia. Armenia last year, for instance, was very insulted by Russia because it didn't help them in Nagorno-Karabakh. Putin said, we will defend Armenia, but Nagorno-Karabakh is not Armenia. And that was that. From that moment on, the Azeri army hit the gas pedal. So beyond that, I really can't comment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I'd like maybe the last question now to go to Luis. Back to Luis.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to change the subject for a moment, but I wanted to thank you for giving us a perspective that maybe we don't hear that much here in our media, and I think it was extremely thorough, and I appreciate it. A lot of food for thought, Eado, and I told you that while talking to you on WhatsApp. I mean, that everything you say is a lot of food for thought, and I appreciate it. Question, I know that currently where you are in Israel, Blinken is there for a summit with the heads of state of Israel, Egypt, and the Persian Gulf countries. And part of the issue there is, of course, the threat of Iran. Do you see what kind of nuclear deal do you see coming up? Do you think the Revolutionary Guards are going to be given like a a free pass, you know, as Iran is requesting to be removed from the terrorist list, from the foreign terrorist list?
It's a good question. It's a good question that we're all wondering, and it's up to your government, not us. By the way, this is one of the reasons that we're worried very much about the Ukraine war. I mean, Israel is a neutral. We voted in the UN and so on. We didn't abstain. But the Israeli prime minister is trying to negotiate between the two sides. We're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place in this story. We want good relations with Russia, and we want excellent relations with the United States. And right now we have a problem. For us, a weak Russia is a strong Iran in Syria. That's a threat, direct threat to Israel. Because part of what's keeping the Iranians at bay in Syria is the Russian presence. They're not allowing them to get too strong. And you probably hear about our air attacks and so on. Part of the reason we were able to do those air attacks is because the Russians agree. They sometimes say they don't agree, but in fact they do agree. So for us, this war is whatever happens, this war for us is bad because the Russians will be weakened. You have in our area other countries that are even worse hit. Egypt, 80% of its grain, its wheat, comes from Russia and Ukraine. If we start having riots over famine in Egypt, a friendly government with which we are at peace could collapse. The entire area is sort of waiting to see what's happening. And now you have this Iranian business. The Iranian business is the feeling in the Middle East. If you remember, Biden tried to talk to some of the leaders and they ignored him over Russia, over Ukraine. The feeling is that the Americans are dumping us and leaving us to the good graces of the Iranians. That is the general feeling in the Middle East, and I assume that that's what Blinken is going to try and ameliorate. How much people are going to believe him is another story. Because for us, this is the number one problem. This is essentially what made the difference that caused the Arab states of the Gulf to come closer to Israel and sign peace accord with us. Common fear of Iran. And whether they'll get more free, again, it's also a question of, let's say they don't get off the terrorists. They're managing well, good enough without it. Now take them off, it becomes even worse. Iran doesn't need all this money they're going to get for the nuclear program. The nuclear program is funded. They're taking money from everywhere else. They're not removing a single penny from the nuclear program. What it'll give them is the ability to meddle more in Syria, meddle more in Yemen. When Donald Trump put the sanctions in place, Hezbollah lost cash because it's funded by Iran. And we had Hezbollah drive to collect donations from the Lebanese population because it couldn't pay salaries. We had this beautiful poster of a Hezbollah soldier in full military uniform, sort of standing there bravely with his weapon, and above him there's a Hezbollah flag and a Lebanese flag. And on the side, there's a statement that quotes, I don't remember if it's the Quran or the Hadith, which says, he who funds the jihad, it is as if he actually participated in the jihad. Telephone number for donations. So this is what worries us. Terrorist, not terrorist, that's a technical thing that'll make their life maybe technically more difficult, but so they do it with somebody else.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Hecht, let me first thank you so much. I echo Luis's comments earlier that it's refreshing, frankly, to hear an opinion other than what we generally hear in this country. So thank you very much for that. And we hopefully look forward to hosting you again, and hopefully you and Luis can discuss writing an article for us for the center. And again, thank you very much. I'd like to remind everyone that we are a 501c3, and please log on to our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org and check us out. I also want to remind everyone that on Wednesday, we have another event from a different perspective on the Ukrainian situation. It's called, that event is called Civic Responses to Russia's War on Ukraine. And we look forward to everyone joining us at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time here in the US. And with that, I will say, Dr. Hecht, hopefully when you recorded this, it's going to my cloud, but if not, just send it to me. And so again, thank you very much. I thank everyone in attendance. And with that, for you, Dr. Hecht, Erev Tov, and for everyone
Erev
else,
Tov.
good afternoon.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so I have to shut it down now, right?
Yeah, just shut it. You don't have to stop it. Just close it down. It automatically saves.
Okay, so I'll do the stop recording first.
Okay, great.